Okay, just give it a moment. And we are live in 3, 2, 1.
All right. Wonderful. Okay, I think people are still joining us, but we can get started. So, hi everyone. I can see known and friendly faces in the gallery. It's very exciting. I am very, very, very pleased to have Pamela Ballinger as our first book talk guest of the year in the program for the study of Italy, which is within the Institute of European Studies at UC Berkeley. I'm going to read a somewhat formal introduction of Pam, and then I will probably add a couple of comments. Pam has some introductory notes herself, but as I think everybody knows, now I'm not sure Zoom will pick this up, we'll be talking about her book that will not, the adventures. All right, we'll be talking about Pam Ballinger's book, The World Refugees Made, Decolonization and the Foundation of Postwar Italy. But first, let me say a couple of things about Pam. Pamela Ballinger is Professor of History and the Fred Cooney Chair in the History of Human Rights in the Department of History at the University of Michigan. She holds a degree in anthropology, BA at Stanford, MPhil at Cambridge, MA at Johns Hopkins, and a joint PhD in anthropology and history from Johns Hopkins. She is the author of History in Exile, Memory and Identity at the Borders of the Balkans, published by Princeton University Press in 2003, and published in Italian as La Memoria dell'Esilio, Veltro 2010. And then most recently, this book, The World Refugees Made, Decolonization and the Foundation of Postwar Italy, published by Cornell University Press last year in 2020. She has published in a very wide range of journals, including Austrian History Yearbook, Comparative Studies in Society and History, Contemporary European History, Current Anthropology, Journal of Contemporary History, Journal of Modern Italian Studies, Journal of Refugee Studies, Journal of Tourism History, and Past and Present. Her areas of expertise include human rights, forced migration, refugees, fascism, sea space, and modern Mediterranean and Balkan history. So I'll just make a couple of comments of my own. And again, Pam is then going to speak for herself, and then we'll take questions and, we'll take the chat and so on and so forth. So I really just want to add, Pam's first book is a very important book for people working in the Mediterranean. I think, Pam, of you very much as someone truly formed as both anthropologist and historian, which is, of course, a zone that I think about a lot. How do we ask historical questions of ethnographic materials, and the reverse? So I always read your work thinking a lot about what questions you're posing, because I think always that they're very crafted questions. They're very, very thoughtful questions. You're not someone who starts from an archive and then says, this is what's in the archive. Quite the opposite. And this new book is absolutely, truly a major work in working through many, many kinds of archival sources in order to get at the questions that you're asking. I have a great deal of admiration for the detail and the craft of the book. So, and now I'm just going to sort of put that there for maybe comment later, that, as you know, as some of the people on this call know, there are parts of this book that intersect very much with my own interests, particular places where particular people were settled after the war. But really, the book is part of what interests me about it so much is the way in which it's a very big history. It's a very big history about, the making of refugees, the statuses, the different agencies involved. It is a warren of complicated interrelations between these groups. And this is a whole lot of history that hasn't been entirely written yet. And also it's a book about Italy, or what we call Italy, what anyone in the post-war era calls Italy. So those are my introductory thoughts. And we welcome Pam. I'm not going to make everybody applaud on Zoom because that's just so awkward, but Pam, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Mia, for that really lovely introduction, and just thank you for the invitation, and also thank you to the Institute of European Studies. It's great to have this opportunity to speak about the book with colleagues today. This is my first Zoom event of the academic year, so I'm really pleased to be with all of you. So The World Refugees Made examines, as its title suggests, the world of displaced persons in early post-World War II Italy. And let me just share, I've got a few images. Let me just share them. Is everyone okay with that? Can you see that? Yeah, okay. So the study focuses on how, over time, migrants to the Italian peninsula from the various possessions that Italy lost with fascism's defeat came to be differentiated as so-called national refugees, distinct from and ineligible for the assistance that was provided to international or bona fide refugees. So that is to displacees who were recognized by what was then a nascent international refugee regime centered in the UN and around the 1951 Geneva Convention on Refugees. These former Italian territories from which national refugees came ranged from formal colonies, so Eritrea, Ethiopia, and Somalia, which were joined together after 1936 as Africa Orientale Italiana. Departments or possedimenti would be the language in Italian, so this would be Libya and the Dodecanese Islands. Protectorates, so that would be Albania, and then integral parts of the Italian state that were ceded after the war. So areas of Venezia Giulia that were annexed by Yugoslavia, and territories, parts of Valdosta, and some other areas that were given to France. Using the marginal figure of the refugee to decenter nation-centric historiographies, I argued that the experience of dealing with refugees of various types proved foundational for the remaking of Italy in several key ways. So these were juridical, social, and material. Exploring the experiences of individuals displaced from Italy's lost possessions also reframes Italian decolonization itself, which is tended to figure as exceptional. And we could talk about all the kinds of exceptionalisms that bedevil Italian historiography, but Italian decolonization tends to be seen as exceptional because it's supposedly precocious, it's abrupt, and it's a process that occurs by fiat, that it's imposed largely by the great powers through the 1947 peace treaty with Italy. As a result, so the argument goes, Italy didn't experience decolonization as a trauma in the way that countries like France did with the catastrophe of the Algerian War, nor did decolonization occur through independence movements. And in the study, I challenge some of these ideas about decolonization and reframe Italian decolonization by looking through the lens of refugees' lived experiences as a long decolonization. But before I go further into the arguments of the book, a kind of overview, I just want to note that I'm really happy to return to Berkeley. I feel like the project kind of has come full circle by being here today, because the project has very distant origins in two talks that I gave here a long time ago. This is a book that, as Mia was noting, with all the different archives and so on, took me a long time to conceptualize, a long time to track down the various forms of documentary evidence. But I gave a paper titled Borders of the Nation, Borders of Citizenship, all the way back in 2002 at a conference that Mia organized on Italy, Germany, and Africa between fascism and colonialism. And that was a moment when I was working on my first book about the memory of the Eastern Exodus. And I was just trying to find some new directions, think about where an eventual second project could go. So that was my very first attempt to think about colonial repatriates and the issue of citizenship. I gave a second talk, Colonial Twilight, in 2010, and that was helpful to articulate the way that Italy's decolonization process in Libya and then elsewhere was a protracted one. And it was one that mobilized Italian public opinion at key points in the 1940s and the 1950s. So this is an argument that was very much contrary to these ideas, these claims that Italian decolonization was a non-event at the time. And then in 2016, I attended a workshop on colonial repatriates that was organized by the European Studies Institute. So all of those were really formative and helpful to me as in the long decolonization project, as well as thinking about long decolonization. And as I noted, it would take me many years to track down the archives necessary to fully evidence the kinds of arguments that were just kernels in those early talks. And I'd be happy in the Q&A if people are interested to talk about some of the archival challenges that are inherent to studying both refugees and decolonization. And I just, I want to thank Berkeley, the Italian Studies Department, European Institute, but especially Mia for the encouragement in this long process. And Mia's work, as she noted, we have a lot of points of intersection, and her work really offered critical cues and ideas to me at a time when there really wasn't a lot of secondary literature on these population movements produced during and in the immediate aftermath of decolonization. And in the, 15 years it's taken me to put this together, that situation has changed, fortunately. And so the World Refugees Made both reflects and is in dialogue with new waves of scholarly thinking about Italian decolonization, post-coloniality, mobilities, race, and citizenship. And I see from our audience members, many of you are the authors of those works that have been really helpful to me. So to return to the book, just a few more kind of summaries about the main arguments and interventions. So first, the title. The World Refugees Made, and that was also made for them. This refers to a line of phrasing from the historian Peter Gatrell. This world was reconstructed on the foundations of fascist empire, as what Roberto Perger has called a nation empire gave way to a nation, and then a nation within the emerging European community, right? The turn away from empire and towards Europe. This was also a world built on the rubble of war, one in which the Allied military government and intergovernmental actors like the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, UNRWA, and then the International Refugee Organization, IRO, and subsequently UNHCR would play important roles in an Italy that, at least until the 1947 peace treaty, was semi-sovereign at best. The world that had been shattered was one in which the broader Mediterranean served as what Baruta and Gatkes have usefully reconceptualized as a colonial sea. In framing the Mediterranean this way, they're less interested in the direct kind of one-to-one relationships between European metropoles and the north, on the northern shores of the sea, and colonial territories on the southern shores. So it's not so much France, Algeria, or Italy, Libya. Rather, this gives us a sense of this very complex migratory space that was constituted across and between imperial units, which of course included until 1918 those of the Ottoman Empire. Decolonization of this colonial sea stretched from the interwar into the 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s. So really, we can think about the Mediterranean, not just Italy, as having experienced a long decolonization. And during this process, what had been, these are just some images, think about the long decolonization, but what had simultaneously been a seascape, a laborscape, and an inter-imperial scape riven by rivalries was increasingly attenuated. But who were the refugees who helped fashion the post-1945 order that I concentrate on in the book? I focus on the experiences of displaced persons in the Italian peninsula after World War II. And as I said, only some of these individuals would come to satisfy the criteria for international refugee established by the post-war UN refugee regime. From 1943 into the early 1960s, Italy hosted significant flows of displaced persons, both those displaced by the war and so-called post-hostility refugees, basically those that we would call Cold War refugees. The majority of foreign displaced persons, or people who became identified as foreign, came from Eastern Europe. So these were Jews transiting to Palestine before 1948 and other displacees from Poland, Bulgaria, the Soviet Union, and above all else, Yugoslavia. There were lots of Yugoslav refugees in Italy. Much of the study details the process of how these displaced persons were set off conceptually, juridically, and spatially from individuals who over time came to be deemed national refugees, profughi nazionale, and who were the responsibility of the Italian state rather than the UN intergovernmental agencies. Now, numbers for all these populations are very imprecise. A publication commemorating the work of the parastatal entity Opera Assistenza Profughi Giuliani Dalmati e Repatriati asserts that between 1947 and 1997, over 1 million national refugees from the former colonies in Venezia Giulia received assistance. Those numbers are high, I think, so I suspect that might also include some Italians who came from other decolonizing states like Tunisia and Algeria, and who also were recognized as national refugees. And that's a whole other story that I don't really tell in the book, but I think is there's interesting work that's going on, and to think about the larger population of national refugees, including those who don't come from actual Italian territories. As Italy lost military control and then formal sovereignty over its colonies, possessions, protectorates, and its eastern borderland, individuals, most of them Italian nationals or people who could make some kind of claim to Italian citizenship, but not all, made their way to the Italian peninsula. But in some instances, Italian nationals who had been living in the overseas territories had actually been evacuated during the war, and they were desperately trying to repatriate back to the former territories. So in the book, I also talk about instances where these individuals engaged in what we would today call illegal migration, complicating our understandings of what repatriation meant on the ground to the individuals who were actually undertaking it. I use the Italian case in part to tell the much larger story of how the parceling out of responsibility for the displaced and the construction of legal frameworks like the Geneva Convention on Refugees were achieved only through painstaking debates over how to classify the millions of people displaced by the war and its aftermaths. As one of the premier scholars of international refugee law notes, a consensus after the war emerged that national refugees were not an international problem and did not require international protection. And in a sense, this is a naturalized distinction today when we think about IDPs, internally displaced persons, versus refugees. But achieving this consensus, as I show in the book, was not easy in practice, and it wasn't a foregone conclusion. So this question of how to classify and categorize displacees from the former Italian territories came up again and again, and it actually preoccupied a wide range of actors, including personnel with UNRWA, the IRO, the Italian government, the Vatican, and the British military administrations that temporarily governed Italian former territories in Africa and the Dodecanese. Unpacking the Italian case thus highlights how laborious the work was at the foundational moment of the international refugee system to exclude from the category of refugee individuals like those migrating from the former Italian possessions. Now, the individuals who became known as national refugees often contested their exclusion from this international refugee designation, appealing to the IRO, for example, for inclusion in its remit and help to resettle overseas. And I stress this because I think we need to consider the agency, however constrained, of these migrants and their role in making this post-war order, not just in being made. Although it might seem counterintuitive that some individuals preferred to be recognized as international refugees rather than receive assistance from the Italian state and also have the recognition of citizenship, we need to keep in mind the physical devastation of northern and central Italy at the end of the war and the chronic problems of unemployment and housing shortages that lasted into the 1950s, although there's also change over time, right, as Italy's fortunes change. From an economic point of view, eligibility as an international refugee and assistance to migrate overseas often look preferable to life in early post-war Italy. But beyond that was the fact that, as is usually the case with colonial return migrations, and I put that in quotes, the notion of repatriation obscured the complexity of these actors' relationships with Italy. First, as we might expect, some of these individuals had never been to the Italian peninsula, having been born in the overseas possessions or Istria or Dalmatia, and thus there's an open question as to what their homeland was. If they're going to return somewhere, repatriate, is it Italy, is it Libya, is it the Dodecanese, and so on. Secondly, some of these individuals had been born in other powers' colonies, notably Egypt, Algeria, and Tunisia, and had then migrated to the Italian colonies in Africa and the Balkans. This was particularly true in the Dodecanese Islands, and Val McGuire's work is really useful here. When we think about the experience of so-called Levantini, former Italian proteges, according to the Ottoman Empire's capitulatory regime of extraterritorial rights for those who were protected by European powers. The juridical belonging of such individuals would become very ambiguous and murky after the war, as the hierarchy of juridical statuses of the lost possessions, which ranged, as I've said, from integral parts of the Italian state to formal colonies, was paralleled by a hierarchy of citizenship, from full citizenship to the demi or semi-citizenships of special Aegean and Libyan citizenships to outright colonial subjecthood. In terms of the agency of the displaced, let me underscore here that both the UN-centered refugee regime and Italy's efforts to assist its own displaced persons stressed rehabilitation, aiming to combat the pervasive association of refugees with apathy, dependency, and passivity. This was part of the new humanitarian model encapsulated by UNRWA's motto, helping people to help themselves. So in Italy, this meant positioning national refugees as active agents for the reclamation or bonifica of marginal areas in places like Sardinia and the Maremma, rendering them new pioneers. In this, of course, the national refugees occupied a place akin to that of earlier fascist settlers, and obviously some of these national refugees had originally been sent to state-created agricultural settlements in places like Libya and Ethiopia. But the task in the post-war period was to complete the work of land reclamation that had been begun under fascism, but also to reclaim those spaces back from fascism, and in the process, reclaim the national refugees and cleanse them of the taint of fascism. But this was a highly ambivalent and always incomplete process. In some instances, neighborhoods or resettlement quarters for national refugees were created ex novo. For example, the village of Jabalia near Anzio, which was built for Italians coming from Cyrenaica, but it was built on the principles similar to those that had guided the construction of fascist new towns. In others, refugee quarters repurposed fascist infrastructure, as occurred with the construction or the reconstitution of the Sardinian new town of Fertilia as a settlement for Dalmatian Eastrian refugees and some refugees from Rhodes. Even the neighborhood of Eure, the great second Rome of Mussolini, became home to displaced Italians from Venezia Giulia and Africa. The remaking of Italy's built environment to accommodate displaced nationals was paralleled by juridical transformations, particularly in the realm of citizenship. And the process of remaking citizenship in Italy after 1945 flattened and simplified the complex hierarchical structure of citizenship that existed in the colonial era. But there nonetheless remained problematic categories, and I talk about these in chapter 4 of the book, that included mixed race children in AOI, foreign spouses, and persons of so-called undetermined nationality from the Dodecanese Islands and Venezia Giulia, who became the limit cases for defining Republican citizenship. In the post-fascist world, the principle of jus sanguinis would remain central to Italian citizenship as it had from almost the beginning of Italian statehood. And this had the effect of excluding most former Italian subjects from the possibility of juridical belonging. Then and now, naturalization is difficult in Italy, whereas claims to Italian ancestry, particularly through the paternal line, facilitate such requests. In addition, the experience of caring for its own refugees from the lost territories, I think I can end this now, and I'm almost done, who were denied international assistance, influenced Italy's restrictive policies towards foreign refugees and other migrants throughout the Cold War. In signing on to and ratifying the Geneva Convention on Refugees, Italy became one of the relatively few states that adopted the so-called geographic reservation. This meant that in practice, Italy would only accept European refugees and only temporarily at that. So Italy was just to be a transit country, and this was only altered at the end of the Cold War. But while Italian legislative frameworks have changed in the last 2 decades in regards to immigration, the post-war wariness towards accepting foreign migrants and refugees persists, as does a citizenship regime rooted in jus sanguinis that makes naturalization cumbersome for those without a claim to Italian descent. In the book, I contend that the immediate historical roots of this diffidence towards foreigners, one on evident display in the current migration emergencies in Italy, lies in the process by which displaced individuals were sorted into regimes of assistance after 1945. So just to conclude, as this suggests, this book is very much intended as a history of the present. It was written and researched during Italy's ongoing migration emergencies, with the aim, or one of its aims, being to help historicize and inform understandings of Italy's ongoing transformation from emigrant nation to immigrant nation. So I'll conclude here, and I look forward to the questions. Thank you.
I'll applaud.
Thank you.
Well done. That was a terrific synopsis of the entire book, including the concluding part about being, I mean, not just relevant, but in some ways very much a response to things that are going on now. So I see that Ray is inviting for questions to be posted in the chat or for people to raise their little Zoom hands. So I hope we'll get questions soon. As you say, Pam, there are a number of people on the call whose work really is sort of in conversation with yours. But if we're waiting for just a moment, then I'm going to ask you a question right away. I just, as a follow through from your concluding part, has the book had enough time to be received in Italy, so to speak? Has there been?
Am I unmuted? No, sorry. Oops.
Now I can hear you.
Now you can hear me.
Yeah.
Okay. I think it's been very difficult with the pandemic. So some of the kind of conversations I would have engaged in by taking the book to various places hasn't occurred, right? So, and some books were sent and some unfortunately got lost in the mail. But there's been an article in 24 Ore, and I have heard from different scholars in Italy who are interested in the book. So I think I'm hoping that perhaps in this coming academic year, especially because I will be in Europe for some of the coming year, there will be a chance to have those kinds of conversations. But I mean, I had a number of really wonderful Zoom invitations from colleagues in places like Slovenia and Italianness in other parts of Europe. So, you know, it's also a book that has, obviously all books have different publics and audiences. So there's the refugee studies, forced migration kind of audience, and then the Italy audience, and then decolonization audience. And so I think I haven't really even begun to make to engage in the kind of conversations with comparative decolonizations.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm hoping that's something that together with Italian audiences can really unfold in this coming academic year. I should say that the book came out on March 15th, 2020. It had to have been the worst moment possible.
I'm sorry.
You know, it's funny because my husband, when I was given the date, he said, "Oh, it's the Ides of March. That's probably not a very, very good date." And I said, "Oh no, it'll be fine." And then of course,
fine. It'll be
right.
fine.
So it had, as many of us are experiencing, right? It had a very delayed kind of entry into the world in those first months of the pandemic, when, I mean, we were not engaging in these wonderful Zoom conversations.
No, not yet. I mean, anyway, we do have a question, but I'll just say further to that. I think it's coming, and I would be so interested to know not only how Italian scholars and Italianists, scholars of Italy engage with it, but also, you know, French people who work on French and British Empire, who kind of feel like they've got decolonization whipped, you know, they've got it cornered, they know what it is. And I think that part of one of the many things going on in your book is it also raises questions about exactly what we might call decolonization. And of course, I would notice that because, as all the other aspects of Italian colonialism, it looks similar, but it's actually kind of different. And so that's always kind of haunting mirrors. So we have one question already, and then Stephanie's here with her magic hand, but we'll take the first question first from Jacqueline Adams. She thanks you for your interesting talk and asks, please, could you tell us about the archival challenges with studying refugees that you referred to?
Sure. Thank you so much for that question. I mean, first is, just trying to uncover the traces of refugees, right? As refugees or the refugee experience. So, I mean, I actually started much of the archival work of this project with the intergovernmental organizations that were explicitly helping refugees, but trying then to figure out, how do we track some of those individuals through Italian archives? What kinds of labels, how would they be classified? How do we find them, right? And so it meant, thinking creatively about where some of those individuals might have ended up. So for example, INPS, which is the Social Security Archive, was an incredibly helpful archive because they had a lot of material about repatriation from the INPS settlements, for those who had been in Libya. But again, that when you enter those archives, there's lots of material, and then trying to find the refugee experience, especially when the debate was about, are these people refugees or not, right, can make it particularly challenging. Also, I talk about this in the introduction to the book, the experience in refugee camps, for example, trying to find traces of the kind of built environment of the refugee experience is often challenging because most of those refugee camps were temporary, they were dismantled. The ways in which the documentation around them, maybe they ended up in some instances in a local archive, right? There's all kinds of challenges, and just to try to understand that refugee experience, it can be very complicated. I mean, it's interesting that there's only a few places that I know of in Italy of former refugee camps that are memorialized, that remain as monuments. So there's Padriciano near Trieste, on the karst above Trieste. But it's also a selective story about the Istrian refugees who were there, because there were actually foreign refugees who followed them in the 1970s. And that story isn't really told in that space or exhibit. Likewise, if you go to a place like Risiera di San Saba, it's really memorialized as a concentration camp. And the fact that it was a refugee camp after the war, all of that had to be dismantled in order to restore the concentration camp to be a monument, a national monument. So you're sifting through these different layers and kind of competing histories in order to get at the refugee experience. So those are just some of the challenges, but thank you, Jacqueline, for the question.
Thanks. They are big challenges and multiple. So Stephanie next, and then I have another question in the chat. But Stephanie Malia Home, you go.
Great. Hi, Pam. It's good to see you. Yeah, thank you so much for your talk and for the book, which is absolutely magisterial. In fact, I don't even know if I have a question, but I wanted to comment and just say how much I love the book, but also two things. I was curious about the craft of writing this book. And as you were writing, it's always a process of winnowing down the information of what you're going to present. Was there anything that you left out that you wished that you had been able to put in, or it's going into a future project or something to that end? And the second question I had was more of a curiosity, but just as you were talking about the temporariness of these refugee spaces and how hard it is to find traces of them, which I've also encountered in my research, it brought to mind the vast internal migrations in Italy that were happening from south to north in the 1950s and 60s. And how do you see these refugee spaces connecting with those kind of migration spaces? Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Stephanie. That's a great question. And of course, I mean, we were also overlapped a year in Rome when, working on very similar topics and also experiencing all of these, political debates and humanitarian crises of refugees arriving and migrants arriving in Italy. And so, your work has also been so influential for my thinking. So in terms of, the temporariness, it's interesting because, of course, you in different ways and Teresa Fiore also remind us that these structures are often very ephemeral, and yet they're perduring in ways that there's these kinds of pathways in which individuals with constrained mobilities, right, tend to be contained, and those spaces actually have long histories in Italy. So on the one hand, when you're looking for the actual refugee camp, it's often hard to find. And yet there's these kinds of spaces that have these multiple layerings. And your work is so helpful for thinking about that. In terms of internal migration in Italy and these refugee spaces, I think part of it, not that the internal migration is just about the post-war economic boom, but certainly, that's an important context to the story, especially as we move into the 50s, right? There's a particular story about refugees and national refugees in Italy until 1947 with the peace treaty. And then there are changes that happen in the 1950s, especially as you have economic prosperity increasing, as you have internal migration. That's when suddenly the UNHCR and others who had always kind of agreed with the Italian line that Italy is a country of emigration, Italy is a country that cannot host foreign refugees. Suddenly there's this question, well, maybe Italy can find some permanent solutions, right, for these foreign refugees who've been in camps for 10 years, for example. And so the so-called hardcore, the people who were the difficult to settle refugees, what were their options? There was this terrible dilemma because the immigration countries didn't want people for, a variety of reasons. If they were elderly, if they had certain kinds of illnesses, sometimes because of political affiliations, and so these people are in camps, but Italy says Italy can only be a transit, and yet what are you going to do with these people? So that's when you get this moment that I talk in chapter 5, where outside actors are really sort of saying maybe we can find homes for some people in the so-called empty spaces, right? So that's why they're interested in places in Sardinia, the places that people are leaving to migrate to the north. And I do talk, and when you asked me about something I would have liked to have put in, chapter 5 has these kind of case studies, but they're also cursory. There's so many more things that you could say about these examples. So Fertilia or Jabalia, or the Don Murray Homeless European Land Project, which is one of the very few successful attempts to permanently settle foreign refugees. They're settled in Samajas. It's very small. It's like 15 families. But I'm actually working, I'm trying to finish up an article about that help project because I find it so fascinating from a number of points of view, also because one of the founders of the project then worked with UNHCR in Rome, and UNHCR hired him as a consultant. So this is in 1960 or so, because they thought that this Samajas, this Don Murray project, really could be the model for other parts of Italy and Europe to help settle the hardcore. That's one of the stories that I'm trying to continue to trace out. I'm also very interested in this question of the hardcore. Right now, I'm working on a piece about the hardcore refugees in Trieste. There were many, especially tubercular refugees or people who had a history of tuberculosis, which meant that it was very difficult to resettle them. And so thinking about Trieste, which is also kind of interesting space, of course, in terms of its sovereignty, what happens to the hardcore in the period when it's under AMG, and then after Italy, it returns to Italy. So
Wow.
But thank you for the questions.
Stephanie, that's a great question. Thank you, Pam, for I mean, that was very exciting. I'm looking forward to those articles a lot. We have
Me
a
too.
couple of questions. I know that feeling. We have a couple more questions already in the chat. I'm watching the clock, so we're not in a hurry. But so I have one question from Viola Ardeni. Thank you for this presentation and your work, Professor Ballinger. I was wondering if your book and research I was wondering if in your book and research you discuss the refugees' languages and or how the Italian government and the other agencies engaged linguistically with what was a very diverse population living in Italy and having to negotiate the Italian language and the dialects, perhaps in urban terms like signs on buildings or street names, or in other ways. Grazie mille.
Well, thank you so much. That's a great question. And I have to admit that I deal with language in a very limited way. And I especially don't really discuss the issue of the foreign refugees. And so the different kinds of linguistic challenges for whether it was UN officials or Italian authorities. I think I have one or two maybe mentions that there were tensions in the intergovernmental agencies between the refugees themselves and translators, so the kinds of local staff, because often translators, this was particularly true in the case of those who spoke Yugoslav languages, the refugees would complain that they felt that the translators were not neutral intermediaries, that they had political agendas. I shouldn't say frequently. I found instances of these complaints being made about specific translators and officials. So, I mean, that's probably one of the few places that I note that. The other way in which I talk about language is the issue of the citizenship option in the peace treaty, Article 19 of the 47 peace treaty, which dealt with citizenship for those coming from the Dodecanese Islands and from the areas of Istria, that was southern Istria, ceded to Yugoslavia, and opting for Italian citizenship. One of the primary criteria was language, Italian language as lingua d'uso, which was a very complicated question, particularly for the Venezia Giulia region, given the widespread bilingualism of individuals who, in other instances, might have declared themselves to be ethnic Slavs. And so language was often a necessary, but in practice, not sufficient condition to demonstrate Italianness. And so there were lots of interesting questions around bilingual populations or individuals who spoke only Istrian dialect, and how to think about them in relation to this criterion of Italian as lingua d'uso. It didn't seem to be as tortured, I think, in the Dodecanese case. But I think, you know, you're really hitting on something which is worthy of further investigation, is this, you know, multilingual world of the displaced and the ways in which they navigated the assistance regimes, the world of the camps, linguistically after the war. I hope maybe you'll be interested to do research in that. So thanks.
I have to say, it reminds me of a conversation I had in Latina in, I think, 2008 with a man who had come as a child to the area with his parents. So they had come from Tunisia, and it was really just a chat, but language was part of it, right? Because when the Italians from Tunisia came, right, and then they get to Latina and everyone's speaking Veneto, Romagnolo dialect. I mean, so it's always very local, I guess, is my own. These questions about language are always absolutely specific to place. You can't have a general phenomenon. And then, Pam, I was thinking, well, you were reading archival materials, and of course they are in their own code in many ways. So, but that's a great question. Our next question. So
I add something to that. Sorry, because I'm curious, Mia, if the children of that family ended up speaking Istro Veneto, because I met some Rhodiots, some individuals who came from Rhodes and were living in Fertilia, and the woman's and they spoke Turkish and Greek at home before they came. I'm not sure, they came by the option, so somehow they satisfied the criteria, although they were, at least some of them were Orthodox and then converted to Catholicism. So it was unclear to me exactly how they thought of themselves, but the woman told me that her daughter, who grew up in Fertilia, spoke Istro Veneto, because so there's this interesting way too. We tend to have these monoliths of Italiani di Tunisia, but once you get into these resettlement areas, sometimes then it's also very complicated kind of hybrid identities that form among the subsequent generations, because that was the linguistic currency of Fertilia, so the kids grew up speaking it.
Well, I think it's also a positionality. So another completely anecdotal thing, when I visited what was once called Arsia and so the places in the Istrian Peninsula, I didn't quite understand it right away. There were some very elderly women. They were speaking Veneto-Istrian dialect. And then above them, there was a remaining sign that said Tito. And I had a moment of just thinking, well, this is very confusing and kind of wonderful. But they were, they had a statement to make by continuing to use their linguistic frame, really. So to go back to the man I met, whose name was Janu, in Latina, my recall, this is not a very detailed story, but if I remember right, what he said was that, his parents continued to speak, this Franco-Tunisian language, but he and I were speaking standard Italian. So he was also showing me that. And I was, of course, the American interlocutor. So that also becomes its own designed kind of situation. Anyway, Viola, well done. That's an excellent question. And so on the video, I see Brian Griffith, who's the author of the next question. So I think, Brian, would you like to just pose your question yourself?
Sure. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah. Hi, Brian.
Hi. Thank you, Pamela, for this excellent presentation. And as I mentioned in my written question, for writing this rigorously researched book. As you know, I studied winemaking under fascism, and so I'm working right now on the colonial side of things, and I'm really curious about the occupations of the immigrants or the refugees who were repatriated in Italy. Did they continue in the occupations that they had been engaged in the colonies, or were they forced into alternative occupational paths due to their refugee status?
That's a great question. And I wish I had more detailed information sort of tracking out what they had done in the colonies and what they did at different stages when they migrated to the Italian peninsula. But I will say that, for those who had been sent to, the famous agricultural settlements, for example, in Libya, and then were resettled at places like Jabalia, near Anzio, or Sacida was the name of the cooperative there. The expectation was that they would transfer their skills as agriculturalists to an agricultural project in Italy. And there certainly was some difference of opinion, or I think generational conflict over that, because one of the things that emerged when I spoke with people and did some interviews at Jabalia was that, the young people were not interested in becoming agriculturalists. Especially in the 1950s, right? So Italy's on the move, and they're sort of being put into this, what I think for them seemed like a kind of retrograde model, right? That they're supposed to, and of course, as we know, many of the people who went to the colonies were actually not the ideal candidates from the point of view of the entities that were sending them. IMSS was always engaged in a struggle. They didn't want braccianti, but they got braccianti, right? They wanted the kind of thrifty, sober peasant who would know what to do when he or she got there. But I think for the regime, the project was about creating those people, right? And so there was always a kind of mismatch, I think, between who was sent and, and what the ideal occupations were. So certainly, many of the young people didn't want to remain in agriculture. And one of the people I interviewed at Jabalia said, fortunately, they built this palm olive plant in the 50s, and that saved us. He was able to stay there. So there was this industrial intervention. And then there were these kind of debates from these outside agencies like Aid Suisse and so on, saying maybe actually we need to resettle, if we want to resettle refugees, foreign refugees in Italy, we need to look at industrial vocations and not these agricultural plans, which seemed best suited, to these empty spaces. Fertilia, for example, was supposed to be, it was recast as a fishing settlement, but that was also not successful. I mean, it was this idea that the Istrians, they were good, then they brought these fishermen. There was this very kind of propagandistic, publicized moment where they brought these 13 fishing boats from the Adriatic to Sardinia, and Luce filmed it and so on. But that was also a kind of complicated story, whereas in the end, Fertilia really didn't become a fishing center, right? So, and here too, we see the agency of the refugees that, they're supposed to be considered, in this category, whether it's national refugee or international refugee, or they're supposed to be an agriculturalist or fisherman, but they have other ideas. And so there's a lot of tension, I think, in the way that those projects, those resettlements actually unfold. And in terms of what makes sense, economically in that moment in the 50s and 60s. So you also have a number of people who arrive at these settlements and then they remigrate. They go north in the internal migration to places like Turin and so on.
All right. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
And thank you. This actually leads directly to the next question, which just came to me in the chat. So, but it's from Jacqueline Adams again, so I'll read it to you. Could you please also tell us, and in a way you've just begun to, could you please also tell us about your thinking about how to present refugees' experiences in the book? I mean, I completely, my own view is, of course, it's so hard to even perform the work of trying to get at what was your experience, right? There's so many kind of layers in between. But then this is about, well, how did you present it, or how did you decide how to present it in the book? Was this something that you grappled with? And if so, what were the options you were considering? And I now see Jacqueline on video. So hi, Jacqueline.
Thank you, Jacqueline. I mean, this, I think it also goes back, I think, to what Stephanie asked about kind of the craft of writing this and the choices, and your earlier question about the archival challenges. I mean, it's usually easier to get at the refugee experience right from the top down, from the point of view of, the UN officials or the Italian authorities. And so, I mean, part of this is why, I mean, I wish I could have done more, but why there is an ethnographic component to the book. Although to me, it seems very limited when I compare it to my first book, which really was, a very, very deep dive based on 2 years of field work with former refugees in Trieste, and then with the people in their community who stayed behind in Istria. And this was not that kind of a project. I mean, I did these interviews in various places, but I also was aware that from my first book that, I mean, there was a way I could still be doing that research and never write this book, right? Because there's so many different communities that I'm trying to look at. And one of the things I hoped and hope is that this book will inspire more people, more research on these specific communities. The Eastern community is well studied, but the other communities of national refugees, I think there's many, I mean, there's of course many stories for Istria as well, but there's many stories about refugee experience that are waiting to be told, that, require either interviews with, if people are still alive, or descendants, or a kind of deep dive into the memoir literature, the associational literature of these groups. And so in that sense, I mean, I was always very aware and thinking about these questions of like refugee agency, looking for places where I could see individuals sort of challenging or thinking about their experience or their classification. But this isn't, I don't think it has the kind of richness of refugee experience that, say, my first book does, which is a different kind of project. I mean, that was also a project about memory. And this book also, I made some conscious choices to do things differently than my first book. So I talk a little bit about memory in the book, but the book is really more also about, you know, how these events were understood at the time, and the way I think it's a very eventful decolonization. It's not a non-event. And I do talk a little bit about the amnesia thesis, but there's others like Mia who've done much more work on this question of memory, and many others in the audience. So sorry, I'm rambling a little bit, but it's hard. It's hard to make those choices, right? Because I knew that I'm losing something by not including that. I decided that I wanted, as Mia said, to write this kind of big history, to try to get the overview of the many flows and the many actors, in the hopes that then it would stimulate more specialized research into, I mean, there's so many different questions in here that I could barely touch. And I think there's a lot of stories that are waiting to be told, not just about the refugees, also about those who helped them and assisted them.
Thank you. I'm going to follow up on this. I mean, part of why I was asking about reception in Italy is that this book actually makes visible a whole sequence, you know, of subgroups of people who are supposedly Italian, right? I mean, there's always this tension in any academic scholarly discussion about Italy between, you know, the nation that it's supposed to be, or the state's ideas about being a state, and many kinds of policy. And then currently we always hear about it in terms of people who are ostensibly refugees from elsewhere and have no Italian, you know, background. But your book, precisely because even though it's not as thick a description, you know, a rendering as you would like, actually makes very visible things that are not talked about in Italy all that much. You know, these kind of pockets or waves of people who came and quote unquote rejoined Italy, you know, and then there's this kind of flowing into the economic miracle years, which I also find very challenging in a way, right? Because they arrive in a country in tumult. So these are, that's not even a question. That's just a kind of commentary on, I'll be very interested to see how Italians, or, you know, Italian readers, Italian historians respond to those aspects, because I think they are very off the beaten path with respect to Italian questions of this moment.
I mean, one of the things I would really hope for, that I would like, and I've got to think about how I might, you know, encourage it and facilitate it too, is, you know, even just around this day, like the Giorno del Ricordo, this memory day for the Istrian exiles, and the day chosen is the day of the 1947 peace treaty. Mm-hmm. And you know, there was a scholar at a presentation some months back who, you know, was very surprised. I mean, someone of Istrian or maybe Krainer origin. And when I said, well, you know, the 47 peace treaty didn't just entail the loss of southern Istria. It laid out that Italy basically gave up its claims to all of its territories. The problem was it didn't actually say how that was going to happen, which is why in the book I talk about all the kind of protracted processes and the hopes that there'd be a trusteeship and so on. But, you know, this idea that day is a memory day of the esuli istriani solely. I mean, it's a day that commemorates the loss of all those territories. And, you know, I would be interested to see if, you know, or put together some kind of initiative of the Italiani della Libia, Italiani dell'Ethiopia, and the esuli, to think about that as a common experience, because there is this kind of exclusivity at the moment around that memory day. And I've always found it very odd that they chose the day of the 47 peace treaty, because to me that marks so much more than just you know, Istria or Kvarner and Dalmatia. So
right. Oh, we have so much more to talk about, but I see that our time is ending. But boy, Pam, I hope to hear more about that as we go forward beyond this event. But thank you very much. I want to thank the Institute of European Studies, of course, and everyone who showed up. Stephanie says, thank you, Pam.
Those chats.
Is there anything you didn't? Oh, look, it's 1 o'clock. I don't want to, I hate to hang up, so to speak. Is there anything you didn't get to talk about that you wished you had?
Oh, I mean, there's many things. It's just like, it's if you ever felt that the book were complete or your discussion, right, then it would probably be not a good sign. I mean, that hopefully these are projects that continue to generate questions for others, but also for yourself. And as we were talking before we started, I mean, the project I'm interested in now about infrastructure really comes out of chapter 5, and there's many questions that I'm still trying to answer from this project. But I want to thank everyone for these wonderful questions, and also just for your work that's been really helpful for my thinking and continues to be helpful for my thinking. So thank you to everyone in the audience. And if anyone had a question that they didn't get to ask, please send it to me by email, get in touch with me.
All right. Thank you so much, Pam. Thank you, everyone. Be well, be safe.